we think about containers, it always kind of comes up in like the dev conversation or the DevOps conversation or the platform engineering conversation. But what about if you are an infrastructure person? Maybe you've been deploying ESXi boxes for 20 years. Maybe you've been in the infrastructure space, whether it's bare metal, virtualization, or network administration, or storage, or database administration, a bunch of different types of positions, and which are all still very relevant in the tech world today. I would argue that we literally can't do anything without networking and infrastructure. I would argue it very much so because it's very true. So for all the sysadmins out there, for all the infrastructure engineers out there, I'd like to welcome you to video 1 of this 4-part series, Containers for Infrastructure Pros. And there'll be some blogs around this as well. Now, the first video, we're going to be diving into actually running a container for the first time. What it looks like, how you can think about running containers, different stats that you can see with containers, and a bunch of other pieces. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into the hands-on piece. All right, so first things first, I am RDP'd into this Windows, I think it's 11, yep, Windows 11 box. It's an Intel NUC Extreme, currently running Hyper-V. I probably should think about Proxmox or maybe an ESXi box at some point, but running Hyper-V at the moment. So I have this Ubuntu box here called Docker 101. And what I want to do here is I'm going to start it up. And I'm going to go through the general installation process of an Ubuntu box manually, of course, as we can see. And I'm going to skip a few steps so you don't have to see me do the manual stuff. And I'm going to catch you right at the end of this. All right, and we are here on the featured server snaps page. Now, one of the things that I want to point out to make this a little bit easier, if you want to do it this way, you don't have to, but you can, is you can install Docker right here. This is going to install the container runtime for us. So let's go ahead and click on that, and we will click done. Now this is going to go ahead, this is going to install the operating system for us. So we're going to dive into the future here and we will be back in a second. So if you're doing this thing right now and if you're following along, go ahead and pause the video. Okay, so now that this is up and running, this is one way that we can deploy Docker. But let's say you don't have a VM that you can deploy. Maybe you don't have a home lab or whatever the case may be. You can actually run Docker via Docker Desktop. So let's go ahead and take a look at that here really quick. So I'm on Google here, and if you just Google Docker Desktop, you're going to see download Docker Desktop. And what this does is it actually runs the Docker engine on your local host, on your computer. And you can see that I'm actually running it right up here. So see how it says Docker Desktop is running and Kubernetes is actually running as well? That means that the Docker engine is running on our local computer. So for example, I'm going to open up VS Code here. And if you're not familiar with VS Code is a code editor that you can use to write code, whether it's Bash or PowerShell or Python or Go or whatever the case may be. And it also has a terminal available. So if you don't have VS Code, that's totally fine. You can use any terminal to do the same things we're going to be doing here. So if I run Docker, we can see that Docker is in fact installed. So one of the things that we can do when it comes to Docker is we can pull a container image. Now, what does that mean? Well, a container image is literally like a golden image. So if you have an AMI, for example, that you're deploying in the cloud, or you have a golden image that you created to deploy in your infrastructure, a Docker container image technically, because there are a bunch of different pieces in terms of how a Docker image is built versus how an AMI is built. Those things are different, but the purpose that it serves, a container image, is it's pretty much like a golden image. You can think about it from that perspective. So to use a container image, we would run the Docker pull command against a container image. So if I go ahead and if I run that, you can see that it's actually pulling, or downloading rather, this container image for me. So how does this kind of happen? How does it know where to go to download this container image? Well, let's go ahead and check that out. So we're going to go to dockerhub.com, and Docker Hub is almost like, well, it is a literal hub where you can save container images both locally and private. So if I just search Nginx, we can see here that there's an official container image called Nginx, and here's the command that we just ran. So this is how Docker knows what container image to use. All right, so heading back to VS Code here, now that we have our container image, let's go ahead and run it. So we can run docker run TID, and really quick, what does TID mean? Well, that's a switch or a flag, whatever you'd like to call it, and it means TTY, so a TTY console, that's the T. The I stands for an interactive session, and the D stands for detached. So what does this mean? This means that the Docker container is going to run on our local computer, and it's going to be detached, meaning we're not going to be inside of it as it's run. It's going to be running in the background, and we're going to talk about how to get inside the container in a second. So I'll type in nginx. All right, and as we can see, we have this ID here stating that our Docker container is running. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to run docker container ls, and if you're in the Linux space, you'll know what ls means, list. So if I go ahead and if I run that, I actually have other Docker containers running here, so don't worry about that. But you can see right here that the nginx Docker container is running successfully. So how do we actually get into the Docker container? Well, there's a command called exec, and the docker exec command, it's almost like an SSH. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this container ID. I'm going to clear my screen, and I'm going to run docker exec it. Again, remember, interactive and TTY, but notice here how there's no D for detach. Why? Because we want to get into the container and run inside of the container. And then I'm going to type the container ID followed by how I want to run this container. So for example, I can type sh. And as you can see, it says there's no such file or directory. What this means is we're going to have to use something like bin bash. So when we are getting into the container, we're actually going to run bash. And as we can see, we're now inside of the container. So the reason why I wanted to bring up the bin bash versus the sh, for example, is because depending on how the container image is built, and this is done by the development team, depending on how it's built, you're going to have a few different ways that you can exec in or SSH in, if you want to think about it that way, into the container. Now in this case, we had to use bash to do it. And as we can see, we are successfully inside of the container. And if we look, it says root at container ID. It looks a lot like when we SSH into a box. So if I run ls here, for example, we can see we are now inside of this container. And if we want to, we can run exit, and now we are out of the container. However, if I run docker container ls, we can see the container is still running. So the container is still running, it's just running in the background. So far, we've gone through downloading a container image or a golden image. We've ran that container and we SSH'd into it. Now let's go ahead and look up some stats. So obviously from an infrastructure perspective, we want to see how the container is running. So if I run docker container stats minus a, the a flag means all. Now if I just go ahead and if I just do Control C here to cancel this and I scroll up, notice how there are a bunch of different containers here. And with Docker containers, unless you specify the name, they all get random names. So for example, this one's called Blissful Torvalds, Frosty Ramen, bunch of different funny names here. But of course, you can tag them with a specific name that you would like. Now notice here, for example, the Istio control plane. You don't have to worry about Istio or anything like that. But I do just want to showcase is it does show statistics based on this container. And how is it doing this? Well, it's actually a live stream of container statistics. So we can see the different resources that are needed and that are available to run. All right, now the final thing what I want to do is I just want to clear my screen and I want to run docker container ls again, okay? Now, notice here, we have some additional information here that I want to just point out. Now, there's this command here, and what this means is this is the instruction for the command that needs to run every time the container comes up, and that's again based on the Docker file, which is used to build Docker container images, but that'll most likely be done by your dev team. And then we also have when it was created, the status, and the ports. So this is the port that's needed to run the container. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, let's go ahead and do this. Let's copy this container ID again. and I'm going to run docker kill container ID. As you can expect, it's going to delete our container. So let's say I use this docker run command again. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify a P, that means port, and I'm going to say 8080 over 80. Now, what does this mean? Well, the 80 right here after the colon, that means that's the port that the application inside of the container is expecting. 8080, the port right before that, the first one before the colon that we can see right here, is how you're going to access the container. So if I go ahead and if I run this, all right, we can now see that it's running. If I run docker container ls, we can see here that it's now running over port 8080, and it's sending the data to port 80, which is the container port. That's the application inside of the container that's being expected. So let's say I open up Edge again, and I go to 127 over port 8080. Boom. We can now see that our Nginx container is running successfully. All right, so now let's go ahead and test out one more thing here just to confirm. I'm going to go ahead and change 8080 to 8081. All right, so now let's go back to our web browser, refresh that. As we can see, it's down, but if we run 8081, boom, now we can see the container is back up and running. And the reason why is because, again, this port here, the one before the colon, if we just go back to the code, this is the one you reach the container on. This is the container image port for the application. And that's how you can get started thinking from an infrastructure perspective what containers are, how they run, how you can access them, and how the networks work. Thank you so much for watching.